Hi there. This afternoon, we wanted to talk about segmenting your client base because really you want to give your clients the business review they deserve at a cadence that they're interested in and that best suits your business and their business. So, the first thing we're going to do is take a look at some variables around kind of how to score your clients for segmentation purposes. So, among these variables are things like MRR, ARR, which can also lead to the size of a client. So those are very much typically related, right? The number of users or endpoints can impact MRR or ARR. Influence or reference value. Sometimes you have a smaller client, but they provide a lot of influence in your area, or they're sort of a first in a particular vertical. So they're a high reference value to you. Or again, a new vertical altogether. There's effort. How much does it take for you to support a particular client? What's the opportunity within a client? Maybe, you've only sold in part of your standard stack and there's a lot of room for growth. So that might be a variable to consider scoring. What are their technology needs and dependencies, right? Are they a manufacturing company or are they a lawn care company? So really, how dependent are they on needing internet and backups and a second maybe internet, et cetera? And then what's their industry or regulatory compliance, right? HIPAA compliant clients definitely have some higher standards around certain practices. And so that really all impacts how you take a look at how often you should be meeting with a client. And if you look at all these variables, while you could score every client on each of these, that gets very complicated when the reality of it is this probably just comes down to two basic categories, which is a value category or variable and a complexity. So you can rename these whatever you think suits your company, but I like to just think of clients as providing value and then a complexity level, because that's going to impact how often you need to meet with them. Under the value side, you can see I kind of grouped together the MRR, size, influence, and vertical, and complexity, effort, opportunity, the tech needs, dependency, and regulatory compliance. So what I do is put the value score. So if I rated these on a scale of 1 to 5 or 0 to 100, I put the value along the x-axis and complexity along the y-axis or vertical axis to create a grid that looks like this. And then really what you want to do is start putting your clients in each of these quadrants, right? Maybe this is greater than more than 5% of my MSP's revenue. They're high value, high complexity. I better make sure I set up processes and procedures to make sure I have eye on the prize, because if I lose them, that would be a huge impact to my business. So as you go through each client, you can really categorize where they fall in these quadrants. And I've got some small stable shops, maybe some break fix folks that are in that bottom quadrant that are stable, but maybe there's, if one starts to move toward higher value, that maybe you look at ways to kind of move them along. So once you have all of your clients, right, on a grid, you really want to take a look at each quadrant as they stand. So I've labeled them here A, B, C, and D, so that we can talk about the work that we do based on a quadrant. So you really want to define your business processes for this framework. Think about those high value, maximum complexity clients, right? The complexity probably adds to their stickiness with you. If you're doing all of their cybersecurity reviews, they're HIPAA compliant, they're full stack, right? High value, high complexity. They're probably valuable to you and you're very valuable to them. So you really want to have a regular cadence, at least quarterly business reviews, and maybe some of them even monthly, right? Versus think about the people that are in quadrant B, high value, minimum complexity. So these are ideal clients, right? Your profit margin on them is probably very high, but maybe you don't need to see them as much, but that doesn't mean you don't need to see them, because you really want to make sure that they're happy. Customer health is really important here because they're not as sticky as the folks in quadrant A, but they're bringing a lot of value to your business and you're bringing value to theirs. They're just not as complicated to handle. Quadrant C, they've got higher complexity but lower value. So these folks are interesting because they might be a client that maybe really needs to spend more because of their complexity, and you're going to have to do work on. So as you look at quadrant C, you're really going to work on defining what are the types of companies that live here, and are there goals that I can set for those companies to move them along a spectrum. Either drop them in complexity so they're easier to support, or ensure that I can get more MRR, maybe with some project work to get them up to a point where they need to be, or set a new cadence for their contract. And then D finally is low value, low complexity. They may be some clients that are just using a piece of your stack. So really, are these the folks, if you compare this group with A, are you meeting with them every quarter, and do they need to meet with you every quarter? Or is this group more of an annual type of check-in, and maybe it's remote? Even if everybody was out in the world, maybe they still would only warrant a remote business review. So once you start thinking about the client profiles for each of your segments, you have a couple decisions to make about what process your company is going to follow for each of those. Because in order to scale your business review process, your customer success program, and all of those other types of interactions, you really need to define for each quadrant the workflows. And so the next slide I'm going to show you just sort of has some things to think about per quadrant. So my A's, what do they look like? And what do I want to think in terms of cadence? How often should I meet with them? How often should I check in with them? So I had a client that was $1.7 million ARR. They got a monthly call, a monthly kind of review with us, but also weekly check-in calls. And it was much better to keep track of them weekly than to let anything stew longer than that. And with that kind of value, of course, I wanted to know where we stood at all times. So I had a regular cadence of weekly meetings with them. And then in terms of business reviews, monthly, we had sort of a bigger meeting with them, but then we did 4 times a year quarterly reviews with executive leadership. So 1, 2, and 3 up here, cadence, business reviews, and communication, is all kind of around how am I going to work with this client and who the contacts are that I deal with, right? So I had a regular cadence, regular weekly meeting with my project managers. I would do larger reviews with sort of the next level department heads. And then I did my quarterly reviews with executive leadership. So that's what you want to think about for each of those quadrants, right? Quadrant A, I would think they are at least your quarterlies. Quadrant B, how often do those folks, they were high value, but low complexity. Do you need to meet with them semi-annually, or maybe do a virtual check-in via email semi-annually, and then on every year have a face-to-face or some other type of community, a virtual presentation? For each of those quadrants, you need to think about each of these bullet points. Assessments. We have some folks that use our assessment platform to do a large assessment annually, a subset of that quarterly for the other 3 quarters, and then for the months in between, some check-in spot checks. So 8 to 10 questions, maybe the smallest one's 8 to 10 questions, the next one's 30, and then the big one's about 120. So you really do want to think about, based on your cadence, and again, the quadrant that the client lies in, what assessments they get. It might be that quadrant B and C only gets a big assessment once a year, a smaller assessment twice a year, and then maybe the segment D, quadrant D, only gets an annual assessment with some check-ins. So you really want to start defining these pieces. And I mentioned when we were looking at the quadrants that you really need to set goals. if I have, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if all of our clients were high value, low complexity, or low effort? But you really want to move folks to the right? We really want to get them to be a high value or a high profit client. They may be small, but we certainly want them to be profitable for us. But we also want them to be in the right place complexity wise or effort. If you think about complexity in terms of effort, you want a lower value client to be a lot less effort for your company. So what goals can you set? Those goals can include things like, vision setting for leadership to make sure everybody understands the value of your services. Maybe it involves getting them to move to more of your technology stack, right? They're more scalable, supportable, and stable if they're using products that your company is comfortable supporting. So maybe you create those as goals. And if you really look in each quadrant to define the type of client you're looking at, it'll become clear that their goals pretty well shake out to the same few in each quadrant. So you can really create a playbook then, which is the next thing down, on how to handle clients in that segment. And the most important part of that is you should be able to define the health of a client with metrics. The first time you try to do this, it'll probably be a gut check, right? I feel like that's a healthy client. They check in a lot. I know they're happy. If we put in a ticket, we come to resolution quickly versus a client that's at risk of churn. You need to be able to identify them. And if you have a client in quadrant A that would be red, unhealthy, you need to have a recovery plan, right? It is for my client that I mentioned earlier, that was at the very tippy top, high complexity, high value, $1.7 million ARR. We absolutely had a playbook that if something went wrong with that, we escalated on both sides to executive leadership, got folks on a call, had check-ins at a regular cadence. So we knew what to do if something went sideways for that particular client. So these are all considerations of what you need to think about per quadrant, because not everybody needs the same thing, right? Everyone needs what is suitable to their client, to their business, so that you can help maximize what the technology does for them, which is different than giving everybody the same thing. So that's the equity versus equality conversation, right? You need equitable, something that every client needs. Every client doesn't need the exact same thing. So I hope this has given you some things to think about as you kind of work through a worksheet yourself of where your clients fall, and can start defining what those quadrants look like to really begin to, if not have manual process, but a little more digital, right? Automated in terms of we know the work that's going to happen here. As always, if you have any questions, you can find us info@lifecycleinsights.io, and we'd be happy to chat about any of these things. So happy life cycling. Hope to hear from you soon.